And we should be going live in just a moment. All righty. Well, hello to Mr. Ippolito's history students. This is Mr. Ippolito, and happy Thursday to you once again. I'm going to go ahead. I should make sure that there we go. All right. I I just told the students who are here in the Zoom with me to make sure you don't have your YouTube on and Zoom on at the same time, and that's exactly what happened to me. We have a live chat going, and just a reminder on the live chat that if you do have questions that you'd like to share, that you make them appropriate and relevant. So I'll just remind everybody of that, and then we will go ahead and I'll give a shout out. So Ellie Cooper, hello, Ellie. I see that you are on. You're on live right now. Emma, I see that you are there as well. Luke, give you a shout out also. So thank you if you're throwing that into the chat. Welcome, and good to have you here, Julia, Ellie, Emma, Luke, Julia, and Mahith. Welcome in YouTube, and then live here on the Zoom. We have with us Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, Sadie, and Trinity. You probably will not see their faces, but you may hear their voices. So I'm actually going to go ahead and start off and ask, why don't we go ahead and, if those of you who are in the Zoom, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, we can go ahead and start off with that. And that way we can hear your voice, and then we'll get over to the YouTube chat in just a moment, where we're welcoming Nitya, Leo, Nika, a couple of usernames I don't recognize. And then Trinity, just a reminder to you, if you're on both YouTube and Zoom, you may want to just mute YouTube so you don't get confused. And what's up, Ricky? Okay. So Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, Sadie, or Trinity, I'm going to go ahead and start off with you. Do you have a question that you'd like to share with us? Like unmute yourself and say it.
Can you go over the political parties in the early republic chart?
Absolutely. All right. So I'm going to go here into, I'll do a screen share here, and let's do a portion of the screen. Oh, let's move it over here. And all right, here we go. So Maddie, you were specifically asking about the political parties. Now, Maddie, was there one of these in particular? I'm doing my screen share now. Was there one of these in particular that stood out to you as one that you want to, one that you have a particular question on?
Probably the beliefs on domestic and foreign policy.
Got it. Okay. So I'm going to start off by saying, if you notice, I've changed this here. I've updated it so that future students do not get confused. The domestic policy, I'm going to say, is the same as the economy. So in other words, when I ask you beliefs on domestic policy or beliefs on the economy, what's the difference between Democratic Republicans in how they believe that the economy should be centered around, right? So for example, the Democratic Republicans, they believe that the economy should be it should be an agrarian-based economy, right? If you remember, we've talked a lot about Thomas Jefferson and his empire of liberty, his agrarian empire of liberty, where he wanted every American to own a little bit of land, have a small farm. And so when it comes to their beliefs on domestic policy or the economy should be based on agriculture, farming. That's what the Democratic Republicans believe. On the other hand, Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, they believe that the economy should be based on manufacturing, trade, commerce, shipping, the kinds of things that are important to the people who are living in the cities, right? Those people who are living in the cities are making things, they're manufacturing things, they're trading, shipping, selling, they're shipbuilding, they're involved in those kinds of trades and industry, whereas the Democratic Republicans, they're out in the rural areas. And this is where we get to in what parts of the country were they concentrated. I'll go ahead and I'll jump to that there. The Democratic Republicans, they're out in the farmland, right? They're on the plantations of the South. They're out in the western parts of the states like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York. They're on that farmland. That's where you'd find Democratic Republicans. The Federalists, you're going to find them in those major cities: Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York City, New Haven, Connecticut, the major trade, manufacturing, and shipping centers of the United States in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So, and then another question that came up a lot during the day today in my, I think it was my period 4 or 5 class, students asked, what happened to the party by 1828? By 1828, the Democratic Republicans, we haven't learned about this yet, but Andrew Jackson is going to become like the big leader of that movement. And so he's going to kind of take over the party. That's going to become the Democratic Party, same Democratic Party that's today. Different beliefs. It's evolved a lot since the 1820s, 1830s, but it's going to become the Democratic Party, whereas the Federalists, they're going to disappear after the end of the War of 1812. They will eventually kind of morph into the Whig Party, W-H-I-G, Whig Party. So both of these parties are actually going to go away. By 1828, they're going to be gone. And they're going to be replaced with different parties that have slightly different priorities and slightly different interests. But if you're looking at which is the party of the national bank, which is the party of a protective tariff, that was the Federalists. It becomes the Whigs. Which is the party of farming and agriculture? It was the Democratic Republicans. It is now going to become the Democratic Party. So, Maddie, does that help you with the questions that you had on that section there?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to once again give a shout out to, I think I already gave Ricky Sarmiento a shout out, Christopher McConney and Vanessa, Carly, Sammy Seo, Mahith, and Corinne. Hello. You're there in the chat there on YouTube Live. And Mahith asks, were the Warhawks important? And if so, why? So the Warhawks, I would say, if we're going to do, if we're going to be looking at the study guide, I would say that the Warhawks would fit best in the causes of the War of 1812. I would say one of the causes of the War of 1812 was those Warhawks, those anti-British Warhawks. So these are going to be Democratic Republicans who are going to be pushing for us to be involved in the War of 1812. They are, I would say, Warhawks, the push, that drumbeat for us to get involved in the War of 1812. I would say they were one of those causes. These Warhawks, these members of Congress, like John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, those were the three main Warhawks. They were the ones who wanted to push us into war with Britain in 1812. So yes, so that's where they would fit in. The Warhawks were the ones that were pushing us to go into the War of 1812, for sure. Okay. Why don't we go, since I don't see any questions right now in the YouTube live, why don't we go over to our live participants, and who has a question in the live? Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, Sadie, or Trinity?
Can you go over Jay's treaty?
Yeah, Jay's treaty, absolutely. So that would be, if we're talking about like where would we find it? I would say this is going to address the question of in number 2, what was going on with France and Britain during the presidencies of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. So what did we do about it? So I would say that under George Washington, we had Jay's Treaty, which was essentially just sort of trying to smooth things over with Great Britain. We were already starting to have trouble with Great Britain during this time. And Jay's Treaty was just like, you know what, let's be cool. The Democratic Republicans were not happy with Jay's Treaty. They thought it was a way for us to appease Britain. Again, they were already starting to push us around when it came to trade. We were already kind of starting to be treated like their little brother, or like, it was almost like prior to the War of 1812, between our time of independence and the War of 1812, it was almost like we were treated like a junior country, right? Like we weren't really treated with a whole lot of respect. And Jay's treaty was, I think John Jay, who was the Secretary of State who negotiated the treaty on behalf of George Washington, I think he was not the Secretary of State. He was the envoy to Britain because Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, but he was our representative to Great Britain who came up with the treaty. And essentially it was us saying, you know what, we're not ready to get into a fight. We're not trying to be provocative. We're not trying to be hostile. We're just gonna, kind of do, do what you want, Britain. We negotiated some boundaries, some like land boundaries between the United States and what will become Canada. So yeah, so I would say Jay's Treaty overall, it was just sort of us kind of being really nice to Britain and kind of glossing over some of the mistreatment that we were getting from Britain. I think that's a good way to sum up Jay's Treaty. All right. So I have a question in the chat here. What were the 3 effects of the War of 1812? this is good. Nobody so far has asked me much about the causes of the War of 1812, but I've had a lot of questions about the effects of the War of 1812. So I think this is worth talking about. And we talked about it in class today. So maybe I could call upon, let me stop my screen share for right now. Maybe I could call upon somebody who's in here live. What was one of the effects? So you don't have to hear my voice constantly. Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, or Sadie, what was one of the effects of the War of 1812?
America will be taken seriously as a country.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing was that we were actually, you know what? After the War of 1812, we got some street cred. Like we didn't win any territory necessarily. I apologize for my dog barking. It wasn't like we didn't take over. We tried to invade Canada. That didn't quite work. We had, I'm going to write this down so that you can see this in writing. We had what was called status quo antebellum. And I think we saw this in one of the videos that we watched, or we heard this term, and we really didn't talk too much about it, but let me go ahead and hold this up to the camera here so you can see this. Status quo antebellum. What this term means is we're going to go back to the way things were before the war started. Status quo antebellum. So we didn't gain any territory. We didn't lose any territory. But what we gained was we gained respect on the world stage. We gained confidence. We all of a sudden, we stood up to the greatest power on earth, and we didn't lose. We didn't win necessarily, but we didn't lose. And so the fact that we were able to stand up to Britain not once, but twice, once in the Revolution, again in the War of 1812, we were proud of ourselves. We stood up for ourselves. So that would be one effect of the War of 1812. What's another effect of the War of 1812?
The Federalist Party was dissolved.
Yep, Federalist Party went away. We didn't talk too much about it, but they had a meeting called the Hartford Convention, and basically in the Hartford Convention, most of the things, this is what John Green talked about in Crash Course, most of the reforms that they were asking for were common sense. They were upset with the war. If you recall, the Federalists were pro-British, so Federalists are not going to be fans of going to war with Britain. But they gathered together in Hartford, Connecticut, and they had pretty much a list of reasonable demands. But the one unreasonable demand that they made was, if these demands are not met, or the one unreasonable claim they made was, we're going to secede. We're going to break away from the Union if we need to. Massachusetts, we're going. Connecticut, Rhode Island, we're gonna bounce. We're gonna be out of here. And that's just like, so that threat of secession was pretty much what made the Federalists look unreasonable. It made them look extreme. And so as a result of that, the Federalist Party was pretty much non-existent after the War of 1812. So effects of the War of 1812, greater respect on the world stage, greater self-respect for us as Americans, and also the dissolution of the Federalist Party. What else? Anything else?
Native Americans decimated.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, we did, Lexi. We did talk about that, or we talked about it in one of my classes specifically. I did use those exact words. The Native Americans, not all over, but the Native Americans certainly in the Ohio River Valley suffered heavy losses. I think John Green said it best in Crash Course when he said, "You know what? There were no winners in the War of 1812, but the losers, the main losers of the War of 1812, unfortunately, were those Native Americans who tried to take a stand. They were trying to basically just stand up for their ancestral homeland in the Ohio River Valley. They allied themselves with Britain. And once Britain, figured that they couldn't win, right? It was pretty much a stalemate. Britain withdrew. And once Britain withdrew from the Ohio River Valley, it was just the Native Americans with, let's face it, they had inferior war technology, inferior weapons versus the superior weapons of the United States Army. There was no way that they were going to compete without British support. And so that would be another effect of the War of 1812 as well. Okay, anything else we're missing? Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, or Sadie?
We got the Star Spangled Banner.
Oh my goodness. Yes, of course we did. We got our national anthem. So that kind of ties in with that sense of national pride, right? That sense of national identity, national pride. How could I forget the Star Spangled Banner? Yes, our national anthem. So we totally got that out of as a result of the War of 1812 as well. Good call, Maddie. Thank you. Okay. I think we're ready to move on. I think we've talked a lot about some really good effects of the War of 1812. So I think we're ready to move on now to our next question. And I'm going to, so Cameron is asking questions 6 and 7 are both confusing. Can you go over both of them? It's funny because we've been talking about them today in periods 4, 5, and 6, but Cameron's in my period 1 class. So it's probably worth talking about, just making sure. And really what I want to make sure that you understand is also what you don't need to know, right? So let me go ahead and just kind of share with you what you need to know and what you don't need to know. First of all, of course, we struck the first and the last sentence. So how did events in the US affect Latin America in the same time period? What we focused on in our discussion was that the United States, the American Revolution, that is going to end up starting like a chain reaction. I think the phrase we used today was it lit the match, or it lit the spark that is going to inspire revolutions, democratic revolutions all over the world. It's going to inspire, in part, the French Revolution, the revolution in Haiti, right, where Toussaint Louverture, he leads a revolt of enslaved people to overthrow their French control in the Caribbean island of Haiti. And then it's going to inspire Simon Bolivar in South America and Jose de San Martin in South America also. So I would say the biggest effect that the United States has in Latin America, late 1700s, early 1800s, and then of course in Mexico as well, the Mexican Revolution, is that the US sets that example. They show, well, if the Americans can do it, then then we can do it too, right? And so that sets off a chain reaction of other democratic revolutions, which have now been happening, over the last 200 years. Democratic revolutions have been happening, and they have been inspired by the example of the American Revolution, of overthrowing colonial power, or overthrowing a larger control that is kind of farther away in favor of more local control. So that would be, I think, the answer to question number 6. And then question number 7, which members of Congress were outspoken in supporting the American system? We really just talked about one man. That was, I think there's a delivery at the door. My dog is letting me know that. That was Henry Clay, right? Henry Clay, as we said, was kind of one of the first leaders of this new up-and-coming Whig party. And Henry Clay and the Whigs were supporting this American system. There were 3 parts to the American system that we talked about. We've talked about the last couple of days. One is a protective tariff. In other words, you charge a tax on stuff that's coming into our country, stuff that was being made in Britain or France or other parts of the world. That is a protective tariff because it protects American industry. Because you look and you're like, okay, let's use a modern example. I could buy this BMW that is made in Germany, but I'm going to pay an extra $10,000 or $15,000 tariff on that BMW because it's made in another country. Or I could buy an American luxury car. I could buy a Cadillac, for example, and that's going to cost less. Or what Cadillac is going to do, that's General Motors, they might just end up tacking on, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 more to the price of the Cadillac because there's the import tariff on the BMW. So American manufacturers can make more money when you have a protective tariff. You're protecting American industry, you're protecting American business, you're giving American workers more money by having that protective tariff in place, by basically almost like a penalty that American consumers pay if you really want to buy stuff that comes from another country. You're going to pay a little bit of a penalty, you're going to pay a tax for that. So they were in favor of that because that protects American industry, it protects American workers. So American system, protective tariff. American system was, and now I'm drawing a blank on the bank, supporting the Bank of the United States, rechartering the Bank of the United States to protect American money, and then finally the transportation and internal improvements, right? So internal improvements, in other words, linking the Atlantic coast to the resources, to the brand new cities that are popping up in like on the western frontier: Cleveland, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois. Those new cities where manufacturing is starting to happen, they need to get their stuff from where they are in the interior of the country out to the Atlantic coast for trade. And so building canals, roads, and railroads, that was the American system. Transportation and infrastructure, protective tariff, and rechartering the Bank of the United States. Okay. Cameron, hopefully that answered your question. Sammy CO is now asking question number 3, who were the Barbary pirates? What did they do? What was our response? Okay, so Barbary pirates, if you recall, the Barbary pirates were on the north coast of Africa, right? And they were raiding ships, not only American ships, but also ships from Europe, ships from all over the world. And basically they were charging, you remember this word here? I have it on a Post-it note back in my classroom, but I am in my home office, my home classroom right now. So I'm going to put this again on a Post-it note. that word that begins with the letter T. It means basically you have to pay a bribe in order for them to not mess with you, right? And that word is called tribute, right? So you're going to have to pay tribute. You're going to have to pay this bribe in order to not be messed with. And so the countries of Europe were very happy to pay that bribe. But the United States was like, no, we are not going to pay a bribe to somebody just so they won't attack us, so they won't board us, so they won't kidnap us, so they won't seize our cargo. And so American ships were seized. American sailors were captured. They were held in, you remember the Marine Corps hymn, the song, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. So Tripoli is in what is today Libya, on the coast of North Africa and the Mediterranean coast. And so Thomas Jefferson, and we got to give a shout out to President John Adams too. President John Adams, considered the father of the American Navy. He really invested a lot of money into the Navy, and by extension, the Marines. The Marine Corps was a part of the Navy at that time. And so they were, because of President John Adams, Thomas Jefferson had the firepower, had those trained Marines and sailors from the Navy to go lead a raiding party, capture, bring back our captured sailors, and basically send a message to those pirates that you're not going to mess with us. We captured Tripoli. We raised the American flag over Tripoli. The first time the American flag has ever been raised over any foreign soil was in our raid on Tripoli. And so that was the lesson from the Barbary pirates: is don't mess with us. Don't try to, we're not going to pay tribute. We're basically not going to, we're not going to give in to terrorism. We're not going to give in to pirates. We're not going to give in to threats or demands. It's not going to happen. That's not what we do as Americans. So that's number 3. Okay. Very good. Carly asks how many questions on the test? Somewhere between 10 and 1,000. That's always my answer, right, Carly? So more realistically, there's going to be some multiple choice, and there will be more multiple choice, or true false, or choose one or the other. There might be a section on like Hamilton or Jefferson, choose one or the other, and then there will be a written portion as well. So I would say probably similar to what you've been used to in tests past, probably between 30 and 35 questions is about probably where we'll be. Ops on 60 frames per second asks number 2 on the political parties. So number 2, in what parts of the country were they concentrated? I already talked about this, already went over this. Democratic Republicans were in the South and in the western parts of the states, the farmland, and Federalists were in the big cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Baltimore, those cities like that. That's where they got their support. Already talked about that earlier in the YouTube live. And then Ella asks, can you go over number 4? I absolutely can. Yes. So Tecumseh and the Prophet, we learned about Tecumseh and the Prophet when we watched We Shall Remain, Tecumseh's Vision. That video, there was a lesson involved in that. There were some questions that you answered. So Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader. The Prophet, his given name, his birth name was Lalawithika. And if you recall the story, like Tecumseh was kind of sort of the wiser, calmer, more reasonable older brother. The younger brother, Lalawithika, he was, a little bit more hot-tempered. And if you recall, there was a story of him accidentally shooting his eye out because he got impatient. And so there was an interesting, if you watch that video, interesting kind of, especially if you have siblings, older sibling, younger sibling dynamic there. They were leaders. Tecumseh specifically was the leader of the Shawnee tribe in the Ohio River Valley. That's where they're located. And how do they all fit in with the War of 1812 and land disputes? They were trying to take a stand. They were trying to lead their tribe, the Shawnee tribe, and other tribes in the Ohio River Valley to take a stand against the Americans, against American settlement, white settlement that was moving into the frontier in the Ohio River Valley area. They were taking a stand prior to the War of 1812, and then their last stand was at the War of 1812. Tecumseh lost his life in the War of 1812, and then his younger brother, the Prophet, Lalawithika, tried to take over, tried to lead the fight and was unsuccessful. So it was just representative. Their story is representative of sort of this, this noble attempt by the Native Americans to hang on to their ancestral lands, but ultimately they would lose those lands in the battles that preceded the wars that preceded the War of 1812, and then finally the War of 1812 was sort of the last stand there. Okay. Kendall asks how many points, she's asking this in the Zoom chat, how many points is the exam worth? Again, I would just say you've had 3 of my exams so far, so I think in the 50 to 60 point range, because each of the multiple choice is usually worth 1 point each. And then the short answer questions are worth, 2, 3, 4, 5 points each usually. So I think it ends up working out to be about 50, 60 points total, I think. Okay, so Addie Sanchez is asking, so Ella Strang, I think I covered Tecumseh and the Prophet. Let me just kind of shift things up a little bit. Can you go over, so Ella, we answered Tecumseh and the Prophet. Addie Sanchez asks, can you go over what caused the War of 1812? Yeah, so the causes of the War of 1812, again, I need to just take a drink of water. So I'm going to ask my team here, Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, and Sadie, are you willing to share one of the causes of the War of 1812? Just go ahead and unmute yourself if you can.
Jefferson's Embargo Act.
And I will say this, I don't know if the Embargo Act was necessarily a cause of the War of 1812, but I would say that it was one of those things kind of marching on the road to the War of 1812, because it was one of those, it represents a marker in the conflict, right? There was that conflict between Britain and between the United States and Britain, the United States and France. And so one way that President Thomas Jefferson tried to deal with it was just by having the Embargo Act. You know what? We're not going to trade with anybody. We're taking our ball, and we're going home. We're not going to play. We're not going to trade. We're not going to interact with anybody. I wouldn't call it a cause, but I would definitely say that it was kind of a link in the chain of events that would ultimately lead to the War of 1812. Another cause of the War of 1812.
Impressment of American sailors.
Impressment of American sailors. So yes, absolutely. So British impressment of American sailors, that was for sure a cause of the War of 1812. Yes, because we were being mistreated. Our sailors were being captured. Now, in John Green's crash course, he kind of talked about there was a little bit of a gray area there, and so it was not entirely unreasonable for the British to think that some of our sailors really belonged on their ship. So there was a little bit of a gray area, but at the end of the day, the British were capturing Americans and forcing them into labor, into service on British naval ships. So we talked about kind of the Embargo Act being a link in the chain. We talked about British impressment of sailors. What's another cause of the War of 1812?
Warhawks.
The Warhawks, I would say, yeah, that drum beat, the Warhawks, just kind of like pushing us closer. Any other causes of the War of 1812?
Native American attacks.
Native American attacks on the Western frontier. And I think those Native American attacks that were, I don't want to say provoked, but maybe encouraged or supported by the British. I would say that would probably be, that could probably be considered another cause of the War of 1812 as well. I am looking, I'm looking here because I just want to make sure that I didn't throw anything in my Quizlet that we haven't already talked about. So in the Quizlet, under causes of the War of 1812, which you have full access to the Quizlet and all these flashcards as well, we talked about British impressment of sailors. Let me go ahead and do a screen share here so you can see, like, oh, Quizlet, that's fun, that's good. So in the Quizlet, I have all the causes of the War of 1812 right here. United States suspected the British of encouraging Native American rebellion. We just talked about that. The Warhawks were pushing that drumbeat. American frontiersmen wanted more free land, and this is kind of related to their incursions with the Native Americans there in the Ohio River Valley. The Warhawks wanted, the possibility of annexing Canada and Florida. We really didn't talk much about Florida, but yeah, there were some Warhawks that you just wanted it to be a war of expansion. They wanted to add more, more land to the United States. Despite the Embargo Act and then later the Non-Intercourse Act, which basically said we'll trade with every other country except Britain and France. That was the next part of the Embargo Act there. Hostilities could not be cooled. Those hostilities specifically with Britain. And then eventually the United States sided with Britain against France because that makes sense. It makes sense that we ultimately were friendlier with France. This is during the Napoleonic Wars, right? We're friendlier with France because President James Madison is a good friend of President Thomas Jefferson. They were both Democratic Republicans. And as you know, the Democratic Republicans were Francophiles, right? They were Francophiles, which means they were more partial to France than they were with Britain. Nobody was following the advice of George Washington, where he said, cultivate peace and harmony with all nations. Don't play favorites. We weren't following George Washington's advice, and we ended up going to war with Great Britain. Okay. So Addie, I think we did a good job of covering what caused the War of 1812. So Addie, that was a really good question. Leo, what is the corrupt bargain? You know what? That, for some reason, that ended up in the vocab, and you don't need to study it because we never, well, I'll explain what it was. In the election of 1824, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, they were all three. They were the top three vote getters in the Electoral College. Nobody got an electoral majority, so it went to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay knew that he wasn't going to get the support of everybody, and so he went ahead and he actually threw his support to John Quincy Adams. I'm kind of simplifying this because he hated Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay hated Andrew Jackson, and so he's like, I know that I'm not going to get enough votes because I'm kind of, I'm kind of difficult to get along with, and not a lot of people like me. But he was very influential, but just not a lot of people liked him. And so he went ahead and he threw his support. He was the Speaker of the House at the time. He threw his support to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams ended up winning the presidency, even though more Americans voted for Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but John Quincy Adams ended up in the end winning the vote in the House of Representatives, because when nobody wins an electoral majority, the vote goes to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams won in 1824. And then later, when John Quincy Adams was inaugurated, he named Henry Clay his Secretary of State. And people were like, what? That's because Secretary of State was like a stepping stone to become president, because Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State. James Madison was Secretary of State. James Monroe was Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State. Like that was like that's how you, even more than being vice president, that was kind of the next, the step right before becoming a president. That's how you get set up. So Andrew Jackson and his supporters, long story short, they say, you know what, that was a corrupt bargain, because Henry Clay, you got John Quincy Adams elected president, and then as a result of that, John Quincy Adams picked Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. Side note and fun fact, Henry Clay never became president of the United States. He ran, I think, 4 different times and was never elected president. So it may have been a corrupt bargain, but it didn't work out in the end for Henry Clay. He didn't get what he wanted, which was to be the president. So Leo, that answers your question. There you go. Could you explain more? Corinne asks about the different parties' beliefs on foreign policy. Corinne, we talked about this right at the top. Maybe not. But no, actually, we didn't talk about. I talked about it earlier today, but I didn't talk about it in this review, so I'll talk about it right now. I'll move this back over here. So when we're going over political parties, right? Political parties and what they believe, and this is actually going to be super, super simple. Beliefs on foreign policy. The Democratic Republicans support France, and the Federalists support Britain. That's all. Like beliefs on foreign policy. This question is not any more complicated than that. Democratic Republicans, Madison, Jefferson sided with France. Hamilton and the Federalists side with Britain. So, Corinne, that answers your question. Christopher McConaughey, can we please go over number 7? So, Christopher, we talked about number 7 previously. So, just for the sake of time, because it's already 1:53, I'm not going to go over it again. But if you rewind after we're all done, you can go back and watch the part where we talk all about the American system. Or you could watch the YouTube video. They actually might even cover it more quickly than I do, because I tend to talk a lot. Go into Google Classroom, look for video, the American system, and it's right there as well. Ricky asks, can we go over number 4? And we talked about number 4 already. Talked about that like 10 minutes ago, Tecumseh and the Prophet. So yep. Yeah. Corinne, not any more complicated than that. So Ricky, same advice that I just gave Christopher, just rewind and you can hear me talking all about Tecumseh and the Prophet and the War of 1812. And, basically the tragedy of Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley in the early 1800s. So, okay. Hey, I'm noticing not any questions currently in the YouTube live chat. So I'm going to go back over here to our Zoom chat, where we still have, let me stop this share for a moment. We still have Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, and Sadie hanging out with us. And Nia asks, in the War of 1812, was America neutral with France, or did they fight on their side? Well, in the War of 1812, okay, so let's put this in context. The War of 1812 was part of a larger, you could almost call this like a world war. This was part of a larger world war or a set of wars called the Napoleonic Wars. kind of centering around mostly around Britain and France. So we did not. So the War of 1812, just to be clear, United States on one side, Britain and the Native Americans of the Ohio River Valley on the other side. So United States versus Britain and Native Americans. I guess indirectly we were on the same side as France in that we were both fighting against Britain. Like we both had the same common enemy, but we never shared a battlefield together, right? So in World War II, Britain and France and the United States, and like we were fighting in Canada and Australia, like we were fighting side by side together as allies on the same battlefield, joining the same cause, like sharing the same hospital beds. We were allies then. In the War of 1812, we were connected with France only in that we had the same common enemy, which was Britain. France was fighting Britain in Europe. We were fighting Britain in North America. So hopefully that helps to answer Nia's question about that. Kendall asks, can you go over the vocab word Old Ironsides? Old Ironsides, did I talk about that? I think I talked about that earlier. That's the USS Constitution, right? Or am I going crazy? Old Ironsides. Maybe I talked about it. This is the problem with having a YouTube live review so close to class, as I forget. I'll talk about it really quickly again. Old Ironsides, that is the USS Constitution. I think I must have talked about it earlier in class today. The USS Constitution, it was a battleship, which is actually still a commissioned ship in the United States Navy. That the USS Constitution was kicking butt against the British. That was our ship, and nicknamed Old Ironsides because when the British fired, I want to say it was I forget the name of the British ship, but the Guerriere maybe. The British ship fired its cannons against Old Ironsides, against the USS Constitution, and the cannonball just bounces off of wood. It bounced off of wood. It was Spanish oak. It was like this thick. I have stood on the deck of Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution. It's in Boston Harbor, and it's amazing. And you should check it out. If you're ever in Boston, please visit Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution. It's amazing. Okay, and then Kendall also asks number 8, please. Well, yeah, I can do number 8. Number 8 is the 7 types of propaganda. Okay. We spent a good couple 2-3 days on the 7 types of propaganda. Here's what I'm gonna do, make it real simple for you. I'm going to show you different propaganda posters, propaganda images, and you will have to identify which type of propaganda it is using. So you just need to know those 7 types of propaganda: glittering generalities, transfer, plain folks. Like you just need to know those. You'll need to be able to identify those. And if you want some more practice, then you can always go to you can go to Google Classroom. Here, I'll go to period 1. They're all the same, but I'll go to period 1. Let me do a screen share here, and I'll show you. We have so many items here in our unit 4 that what happens, and I've had some students say, Mr. Ippolito, I can't find something. Well, you just need to click view more. And then you can view more, and then you can see everything. All the older stuff starts popping up. You might need to click view more again. Anyway, if you're ever looking for stuff and you can't find it and you need it, you scroll down, you're like, hey, I can't find Washington's farewell address. Well, it's there. It's just back from the end of January. So that's why you can't see it right away. You just have to click view more. 7 types of propaganda is here. And if you click on those resources, you'll see that's the article that we read. And then the examples, all those examples of propaganda are in there. So that's the 7 types of propaganda. So there you go on that. Okay, and then so that was the 7 types of propaganda. Kendall, does that help you? Kendall, is that what you were asking? Okay, I'll wait. Oh, yes, thank you. Okay, good, thank you. And then Lexi said, could you go over the beliefs of foreign policy, part of political parties in the early republic? Already talked about that, Lexi, earlier on, and it's just really simple. The Democratic Republicans supported France, and the Federalists supported Britain. That's it. So that's what that is there. All right, let me go ahead and, I meant the role of government. Oh, okay. So that's a really, really good question. Okay, so let me do another screen share here, because yes, I definitely think that you should know that. Yes, so you already know the names of the leaders: Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, also Democratic Republican. John Adams, also a Federalist, right? So those are the names of the leaders. In what parts of the country were they concentrated? We already talked about that. Economy, foreign policy, beliefs on the role of government. The Democratic Republicans believed that government, the national government, should be small and limited, more power to the states, more power to the people, right? Thomas Jefferson believed in the people. The people should be trusted. The people, like, we don't want a big national government. We want to give power to the people, power to the states. That was the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists believed that in order for our country to survive, in order for our nation to be strong and powerful and stand up to the other nations of the world, we need to have a strong national government. Give the national government a lot of power. That was why the Federalists supported a constitution to begin with. The Democratic Republicans back then in the early days, before they were the Democratic Republicans, they were called the Anti-Federalists. They did not want a constitution. They did not want to give the national government that much power. And so we're constantly having this debate today, right? We're constantly having this struggle. How much power should the national government have? Should the national government have the power to give people health care? That's a debate that we're having right now, right? What role should the national government have in education? What role should the national government have in other parts of people's lives? We're continuing to have that debate still today, and it's not, it's still not fully settled. But that debate goes back, 200 years. So that's the difference in the roles of government, Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Okay. I think, did I run out of questions in the chat? Okay. Yeah. So Zoom chat, my people who are in the Zoom chat, I think I've answered all your questions. So I'm going to go back to YouTube chat. Oh, ops on 60 FPS, beliefs on foreign policy. I already talked about that. That was, Britain versus France. Democratic Republicans like France and the Federalists like Britain. Okay, so hey, I think I'm caught up now on all of the questions that were in both chats. So I'm going to ask you, Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, or Sadie. What else? We've been going for 41 minutes now. Let's keep going.
Can we go through the vocabulary, please?
Oh my goodness. Kendall, all the vocabulary? Pick.
No, just
Pick a couple. Give me 2 or 3 that you want to focus on.
War fever.
Yep. Okay. War fever was like everybody, like the people who were like wanting to go into the War of 1812. That was war fever. We really didn't. Honestly, Kendall, I'm glad you brought this up because we really didn't talk about it too much in class. So guess what? It's probably not going to be on the test. I'm crossing off war fever right now. So those of you who are watching this right now, don't worry about war fever. Boom, crossed off. All right, what's next, Kendall?
I don't know.
People are cheering for you right now because they're like, Kendall just got a vocab term crossed off the list. Let's go for another one. Blockade. There is a strong likelihood that blockade will be on there. So blockade is the technique where you have ships and you put them around a port city to prevent any ships from going in or out of that port. You put military ships, right? Navy ships to prevent trade or to prevent like military supplies from going in and out. Blockade, you're going to see blockade come up through the years and in history. The next time you'll see blockade will be during the Civil War, but where this comes up in the War of 1812 is the British were blockading American ports during the War of 1812 to try to cut off our trade, to try to hurt our economy, which we're like, okay, well, I guess we'll just make stuff ourselves then. So we were very resourceful. It hurt at first because we were buying stuff from Spain and buying stuff from France and actually, still buying stuff. Believe it or not, during the War of 1812, when we were at war with Britain, we were actually still buying stuff from British producers because we still liked buying British stuff. So so that's a blockade. Blockade is when you close off a port using Navy ships, military ships, in order to like negatively affect your enemy. Okay, Kendall, give me another vocab term. Impressment. Yeah, that was so impressment will definitely be on there because that was when the British were kidnapping American sailors and forcing them into service on British Navy ships. That was impressment. That's what that process is called. So impressment most definitely will be on the test. Kendall, while you're thinking of another vocab term, Lexi talks about sedition. So sedition is speaking or acting against your government. The word sedition has actually, well, and let's just make sure that we're, let me give you a proper dictionary definition here. So I'll move this over. So conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state or monarch. This word sedition has been used quite a bit in recent weeks because of the assault, the insurrection against the Capitol. And there have been various leaders that were accused of inciting that rebellion, inciting that insurrection. And so there were accusations of sedition, which is illegal in the United States, to commit sedition, to basically to incite people to try to overthrow the government or to try to interfere with the functions of government. When you do that through your words or actions, you're committing sedition. Sedition in this context is, it was with the Alien and Sedition Acts, which we didn't really get much of a chance to talk about. So because we really didn't learn much about it in class, Kendall, guess what I'm doing? I'm crossing it off. So I've crossed off sedition. I've crossed off whatever other word. I crossed it off so much I can't even read it anymore. All right. So Kendall, we got rid of 2 words, 2 terms there in the vocab. Meteoric. Meteoric. I love this word meteoric, and it will almost certainly be on the exam because in the video on Tecumseh, it talked about his meteoric rise. Meteoric rise. So if you think of a meteor, right, you think of like, you've seen a shooting star before in the sky. That's a meteor. If something or someone is meteoric, what do you think you're saying about that person? Nia, just take a guess.
They achieve something quickly.
Achieve great things or amazing things in a short amount of time too, right? Like a shooting star, like you see it burn brightly across the sky, and then it kind of, and then it vanishes. So some historians talk about the life of Tecumseh as a meteoric life. Like he burned very brightly during the time that he was alive, and then he was gone. So I love that word meteoric, and I almost certainly will put it in the test because it's just a fun word. But that was used to describe the life, the career of Tecumseh. Nationalism, it's when you feel pride in your country. That was one of the effects of the War of 1812 was increased nationalism, increased national pride in being American. That's nationalism. Good question. We're having a lot of really good ones that are coming through in the chat here. Ask me another one.
Corrupt bargain.
Corrupt bargain. Talked about that before. Remember, that was the election of 1824. Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson accused John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay of entering into a corrupt bargain to get John Quincy Adams to be elected president. And then Henry Clay became the Secretary of State. So talked about that earlier. It's a good story, but we didn't actually officially learn about it in class. So guess what? I'm crossing it off. Crossing it off. We've crossed off 3. Status quo. Oh, I love this one. Okay, this one will definitely be, well, almost certainly be on the test. Status quo antebellum. So when we use this term, we are talking about the we're talking about the results of the War of 1812. Did any land change hands? Did any money change hands? Nope. In other words, because there was no territory that was gained or lost on the part of Britain, Canada, the United States, Native America, like nobody got or lost any territory. Well, the Native Americans lost, but they were on United States land, right? So between the United States and Britain, no country gained or lost any land. And so we basically returned to status quo antebellum. In other words, the way things were before the war started. That's status quo or status quo antebellum. Status quo literally means let's keep things the way they were, or the way they are, the way they were. So if you've ever heard the phrase, let's just maintain the status quo, it means let's not change. Let's not change our arrangement, our agreement, our friendship, our relationship, our business partnership. We're just going to maintain the status quo. We're not going to have any change. Okay. Really good questions. We've been going for 49 minutes right now. I don't see any new questions in the YouTube chat, and I don't see any new questions in the Zoom chat. Anything else? Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, Nia, or Sadie? Now's your chance to ask.
Outside, I know that the War of 1812 is kind of broad and there were a lot of battles, but is there anyone's outside of that that are important, maybe in Latin America?
You're asking about battles, Sadie?
Yeah, battles are just other like disputes that impacted us.
You know what? We talked about like the Battle of Fallen Timbers. We talked about the Battle of Tippecanoe. Like those were kind of, parts of the United States battling with Native Americans. I am not going to ask any battle questions though. The next time you're going to have battle questions, honestly, is not going to be until probably the Civil War. So you're not going to get a battle question for another couple months. So don't worry about any battles. Kendall and Lexi are both asking about the word precedent. So precedent is when, and this almost certainly will be on the exam, the word precedent. Let's go here. I'll do a quick screen share here so you can see. That's not screen share. Let's do a screen share. Come on. There we go. Okay, so this word precedent right here, this is when you set an example for future generations to follow. That is what a precedent is. And so when we use it in this context, when we're talking about American history, we're talking about George Washington and how he set a lot of precedents. For example, he could nowhere in the Constitution does it say like create a cabinet, like a Secretary of State, Secretary of War. That today that's called the Secretary of Defense, but back then it was Secretary of War, Secretary of the Treasury. Like there was no blueprint in the Constitution that said make these positions. But George Washington had it start from somewhere. So he created the precedent of having a cabinet, a group of advisors who were called those names. Secretary of Treasury. We still have a Secretary of the Treasury today. Secretary of State. We still have a Secretary of State today. Like we still have those positions. Those jobs have been around for over 200 years because George Washington set the precedent. He also set a precedent of serving no more than 2 terms. And every president of the United States followed that precedent and honored that precedent until Theodore Roosevelt. This is actually in the 1900s, in the election of 1912. Theodore Roosevelt, he had served for 2 terms, well, almost 2 terms. He came into office upon the death of President William McKinley. So he served for, like 7 years and 10 months. And he stepped aside, and then another Republican, William Howard Taft, got elected president. And then he's like, you know what? This Taft guy's a joke. I want to come back and be president again. And so he tried to run for a 3rd term. And he was the first person to attempt to break the 2-term precedent. He was unsuccessful. His cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he actually successfully broke the 2-term precedent and was elected first in 1932, and then in 1936, and then in 1940, and then again in 1944. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt broke the George Washington precedent by being elected to 4 terms. And so now it's in the Constitution that you cannot serve for any more than 2 terms. When students ask, can Donald Trump be elected again in 2024? He absolutely can. Yes, because he's only served 1 term. So he could be eligible to be elected to 1 more term if he gets elected in 2024. So that's what the word precedent means, setting an example for future generations to follow. That's a precedent. Almost certainly that'll be on the exam. And then Nia, thank you. Have a good day, Nia. Lexi also asks about infrastructure. Infrastructure most certainly will be on the exam as well. So infrastructure is when you're building up the internal structure of a country or any type of community. For example, if the city of Santa Clarita wants to improve our infrastructure, they might work on roads or bridges or power lines or drainage, sewer lines. Like that's all infrastructure. It's all like the internal stuff, like the sort of like the guts of your country that kind of keep things going. So that's infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure improvements, roads, railroads, canals, bridges, those are all examples of infrastructure. The American system included a plan for improving American infrastructure by improving transportation routes, canals, roads, railroads, bridges, that kind of thing. So that's what infrastructure is related to the American system. Good question. Okay, Megan is asking a couple of times now. Can we go over number 5? Did I miss that, Megan? Or did we? Let me just make sure that I'm not missing anything. And you asked, can we go over number 5? Oh, yes. Yeah, we have not talked about number 5. What is the story behind the Star-Spangled Banner and the Battle of Fort McHenry? Well, we had a great lesson on that. Oh, that was amazing. I loved that. So I'm not gonna tell the full story. Oh, there's Alexa talking to me. Alexa, stop. I'm not going to tell the full story of the Star Spangled Banner because I mean we're running low on time now. But I will tell you this: what you should know is the story of Francis Scott Key. You should know that he was in. This is part of our shared our shared history, our culture, the stories of the story of our national anthem. Francis Scott Key was in Baltimore Harbor during the War of 1812. He was witnessing. He saw the flag as it was waving at dusk as the sun was going down, and then the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. The next morning, he looked. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? In other words, he's asking the question in the poem: is the flag still flying? I saw it. I saw brief glimpses of it, as the bombs were bursting in air and through the rockets' red glare. So that's the story of the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. It's a great story. I love that story, and so I think you should know that story, and that's why I put it on the test because it's part of our shared American heritage. Lexi asks about Confederation. So there was a confederation of Native Americans that were united to try to fight against the United States in the Ohio River Valley. Will I include Confederation? Did we really talk about it in class? No. Lexi, guess what? I'm crossing Confederation off the list. Crossing it off. Agrarian, you absolutely need to know. I'm circling agrarian. I'm triple circling agrarian because you absolutely need to know that. Agrarian means related to agriculture, related to farming. So Thomas Jefferson envisioned an agrarian empire of liberty. That's what he wanted America to be. Excuse me. An agrarian empire of liberty. In other words, a country full of farmers where you don't, if you have a farm, then you don't have to have like a factory job. You don't have to have you can support yourself. You can support your family. You have land. You have a cow or a couple of goats, some chickens. You can support yourself. You can live off the land. That's what Thomas Jefferson wanted. Thomas Jefferson didn't want a nation of employers and employees. He wanted a nation of farmers. Did he get what he wanted? Mostly no. We are not a nation of farmers. We have some farmers. We are not a nation of farmers. Mr. Chunky Chan asks a couple of times beliefs on economy. Yeah, so I think we talked about that earlier, but I'll just review quickly. You're talking about the political parties' beliefs on the economy. So for the Democratic Republicans, they believed that it should be based on an agrarian economy, right? Farming economy. For the Federalists, should be based on manufacturing, trade, shipping, commerce, manufacturing. That's the difference between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Those are their beliefs on the economy. Okay. We've been doing this for 57 minutes, almost an hour. So Kendall, Lexi, Maddie, or Sadie, what are you still missing on your study guide? Talk to me. Not all at once. All right.
Mine's all filled out, so I think I'm good.
Well, that's a good thing then, Maddie. Maddie, you can go ahead and click turn in if you want. Okay. Well then. Lexi asked really quickly, number 7, which members of Congress? So Lexi, it was the Whig Party when I asked which members of Congress, but Lexi, honestly, I just want you to know Henry Clay. Henry Clay was that one guy who was the biggest supporter of the American system was Henry Clay. So I just want you to know that Henry Clay was the guy for the American system on number 7. That was a good question. Katie, thank you. I'm sorry, Katie, you asked before and then I ignored you and I apologize. Katie asks, what about number 1? So let me do that. I think that might be the last thing because we're down to the last 2 minutes here. What were the main points of George Washington's farewell address? How well have we followed his advice? Okay. Let me go into classwork here, and you're going to make me dig a little bit for this because, You have to click view more, right? So we got to go back, Washington's farewell address. And let's click here. And I'm going to expand this a little bit. So, wow, we're going to do this. We're going to go over this super quick. Quote A, basically, this is George Washington saying, you know what? I have decided after 2 terms, I'm going to retire. I can't serve forever. I'm not going to run again and again and again and again. Like, we need to teach them how to say goodbye. We need to move on. Because I love this country, and I love this country so much. I love it so much that I'm not going to try to rule it forever. I'm going to let somebody else take a shot at this. So that's quote A. That's from the farewell address. Quote B is supporting education. Thank you, George Washington. Promote then as an object of primary importance the diffusion institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. So that's George Washington being pro school right there. So thank you, George Washington. Quote C, the mischiefs of the spirit of party. George Washington saying, please, please, please don't have political parties. You're going to fight with each other. You're going to tear this country apart with political parties. Please don't do it. Please don't do it. Please don't do it. And of course we did it. We've had political parties. So we ignored him on the political party advice. Sorry, President Washington. Quote D, citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. So it's interesting. George Washington is saying, you know what? I don't care if you are born in this country, a citizen by birth or a citizen by choice. I don't care if you were born in this country or if you're an immigrant. Love your country. Love America. More than any other appellation derived from local discriminations. Before you love, what part of the country you're from, you love being a Californian, you love LA, you love the Dodgers, you love the Yankees, you love the Raiders, whatever. You're an American first. So love being an American first. That is quote D. Quote E, observe good faith and justice toward all nations, cultivate peace and harmony and with all. Don't play favorites with other countries and try to be peaceful with other countries. And we kind of failed at that. But in our defense, sometimes they attack us first. Pearl Harbor, World War II. Sometimes you gotta handle fascism, right? You gotta I think most Americans would agree that getting involved in World War II was a good thing. It was a good cause. It was a necessary cause. So observe good faith and justice toward all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. We didn't quite follow that advice, George Washington. I apologize. And then finally, quote F, he's just saying, you know what, I'm gonna enjoy my retirement now. I am retired. I am I'm gonna try to enjoy life with my family. Remember little Washi, his grandson, his step grandson. He didn't have any biological children or grandchildren of his own. I'm gonna take care of little, play with little Washi. I'm gonna have time to spend with my wife. George Washington left office in March of 1797. He would die in 1799, so he got to enjoy retirement for 2 years. But in the midst of my fellow citizens, the benign influence of good laws under a free government, the ever favorite object of my heart. He died knowing that the country was moving on without him. And sure enough, in spite of our flaws, in spite of our differences, and in spite of us, we're certainly not a perfect nation, but we are a nation that has survived and has thrived, and I think in no small part to the efforts of George Washington. Okay, we are now at the 62-minute mark, and so thank you. I think this is a good time to pause and say thank you very much. Thank you to Kendall and Lexi and Maddie and Sadie, and I think also we had Trinity and we had Nia. And so thank you very much for spending time with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you for the test, period 1 tomorrow, and then periods 4, 5, and 6 on Monday. And have a great day, and thank you so much for joining.